My name is Daniel. I am the kind of man who keeps his word, fixes things before they break, and assumes, perhaps too generously, that the people he loves are doing the same. I have been married to Vivienne for 6 years. 6 years of her brilliance, her ambition, her carefully maintained world, and my equally careful maintenance of everything that world required to function. Vivienne worked in financial consulting. She was exceptional at it. In the way that people who learned early that warmth is a liability tend to be exceptional, precise, relentless, always 3 steps ahead of the room. I had admired that quality when we met. Over 6 years, I had come to understand that it was not a professional mode she switched off at home. It was simply who she was. I worked in landscape architecture. I designed parks and green corridors and community gardens, work that Vivienne described to her colleagues as something with plants, which I had stopped correcting because the correction never seemed to take. I was proud of my work. I kept that pride mostly to myself. The company dinner was held on a Thursday in November at a restaurant in the financial district, the kind of place where the menu has no prices and the lighting makes everyone look like a decision maker. Vivienne had been preparing for it since Monday. New suit, charcoal, beautifully cut, her hair up, the specific posture she adopted when performance was required, shoulders back, chin level, energy directed outward like a searchlight. I wore my good gray jacket. She looked at me when I came downstairs and said, "That'll do. That'll do." I filed it, as I filed most things, and said nothing. At the dinner I was seated beside her, but might as well have been beside a potted plant. She turned to me perhaps twice in 3 hours, both times to ask me to pass something. Her colleagues were warm enough in a distracted way. The warmth of people who have been told a spouse exists and are now confirming the fact. I ate well, drank moderately, and listened to conversations I was not part of. Then came the moment. Her managing director, a broad-shouldered man named Gerald who told jokes like a man accustomed to everyone laughing, gestured toward me during a lull and said, "So Daniel, Vivienne tells us you work with gardens. Tell us something interesting." It was generous, actually, a genuine invitation. Before I could respond, Vivienne laughed, a particular laugh, light and social and devastating, and said, "Gerald, I love you, but that would take all night and we'd still leave confused." The table laughed. Gerald laughed. Even the sommelier, passing behind us, seemed to find something to smile at. I did not laugh. I sat with the remark for exactly 4 seconds. I counted, the way you count when you are deciding something. And then I set my napkin on the table, pushed my chair back, and said, quietly and without heat, to Vivienne, "I'm going to head home. Enjoy the rest of the evening." She looked at me with the micro-expression of a person whose script has just been deviated from, a fraction of a second of alarm, then the social mask reinstated. "Sit down," she said softly. "Good night, Vivienne." I shook Gerald's hand, said it was a pleasure, and walked out into the November air. Cold, clear, the city indifferent above me. I stood on the pavement for a moment, not in distress, in something quieter than that. In recognition, something had shifted, not broken. Shifted, like a door that has been slightly ajar for years finally swinging open on its own weight. I walked to the underground and went home. What Daniel experiences at the dinner table is not a singular wound. It is the moment a pattern finally becomes undeniable. Vivienne's comment about the gardens was not calculated cruelty. It was habitual dismissal, so practiced and automatic that she delivered it with a social laugh rather than a private whisper. That is the psychological tell. She did not lean in and murmur something cutting. She broadcast it. She had performed this diminishment so many times in private that it no longer registered as something requiring discretion. This is the signature of a long normalized pattern. When belittling behavior becomes reflexive, when it is deployed in public without a moment's hesitation, it means the person doing it has genuinely stopped perceiving it as harmful. Vivienne's internal model of Daniel had been quietly updated over years of accommodation. He absorbs, he adjusts, he does not push back. The pattern had been reinforced so consistently that his feelings were no longer a variable she calculated. Daniel's response, 4 seconds of stillness, then a calm and irreversible exit, is not reactive. It is precise. The 4-second pause matters enormously here. It suggests a person making a decision rather than a person erupting from accumulated pressure. He does not wait to see her face. He does not leave a scene. He simply removes himself from an environment that has, in that moment, demonstrated something he can no longer unsee. The detail of the good gray jacket and her response, "That'll do," is the story's first micro-humiliation, easily overlooked. But it sets the temperature of the entire evening. Vivienne's relationship to Daniel is managerial rather than relational. He is logistics. He is the person who makes her domestic life function so that she can direct her attention where she considers it worth directing. The dinner is simply the night that staging became impossible. I did not expect to sleep well, and I didn't. I lay in the bed that was half hers by location and entirely mine by use. She slept on her side facing away, or not at all when work pressed, and I listened to the city's overnight quiet and thought about the word confused. That she would take all night to explain, and we'd still leave confused. Not boring, not simple, confused. As though my work were not merely dull, but incomprehensible, a category error, something she could not even translate for an audience. I got up at 5:30. She had not come home. The kitchen was as I had left it. Her laptop was on the counter, which was unusual. She was territorial about the laptop. It sat there open, screen dark, the way things left in a hurry tend to sit, without the deliberateness of placement, just abandoned mid-motion. I made coffee. I sat down across from it. I told myself, as I always had, that I was not the kind of man who looks through someone's private things. I had held that principle for 6 years like a passport I was proud of carrying. I understood, sitting with my coffee at 5:45 in the morning, that the principle had been protecting her, not me. I opened the laptop. Her email was logged in. The inbox was organized with the same precision she applied to everything: folders, labels, color codes. But the most recently opened thread was still on screen. I had not searched for it. It was simply there. The thread was with a man named Philippe. His email signature identified him as a senior associate at a firm 3 floors above Vivienne's in the same building. The thread was 14 months long. I did not read every message. I read enough. The affair itself was not, in the end, what stopped me. What stopped me was a message from 4 months ago in which Vivienne described a dinner I had cooked, a Moroccan lamb dish I had spent most of a Saturday preparing for her birthday, and wrote, "He made this elaborate thing with lamb and spices that took him hours. I ate half and said it was wonderful. He was so pleased. Philippe, I swear, sometimes I think I'm managing a very earnest intern." I read that 3 times. Then I closed the laptop and sat with my coffee until it was cold. A very earnest intern. Not a husband. Not a partner. Not even a person she was in conflict with or growing away from. An intern. Someone whose enthusiasm she found mildly touching and efficiently redirected. Someone whose satisfaction was something she managed rather than something she shared. What I felt was not rage. I want to be accurate about that, because accuracy matters when you are deciding what to do next. What I felt was the specific clarity that arrives when you have been shown, at last, the mechanism behind something you sensed but could not name. The lamb dinner. The corrected introductions. The "that'll do" at the bottom of the stairs. All of it, filed and organized and reported to someone else as evidence of my charming inadequacy. I showered. I dressed. I called a colleague whose brother was a family lawyer and asked for a name. The name was Simon. I called him at 9, and he had a cancellation at 11. By noon, I was on my way home with a folder of notes and the beginning of a plan. The discovery here operates on 2 psychological levels that are worth separating carefully. The first is the affair itself, the structural betrayal of the marriage. The second, and more psychologically significant, is the email. Understanding why the email lands harder than the affair requires examining how human beings construct and maintain self-concept within relationships. Daniel had sustained his sense of relational worth through a specific internal narrative. I am the person who takes care of things. I do this well. It matters. This is not grandiosity. It is the coping mechanism of a person in a chronically undervalued role. You tell yourself the value is real even when it goes unacknowledged, because the alternative, accepting that your efforts are invisible, is too corrosive to sustain daily life. Vivienne's email demolishes this narrative with surgical precision. She is not describing a husband she resents or a partner she has grown apart from. She is describing someone she finds amusing. The earnest intern image is devastating because it contains no malice, only comfortable condescension. This is the cognitive distortion of entitlement. She has redefined Daniel's acts of love as acts of naivety, and in doing so, positioned herself as the sophisticated observer of his simplicity rather than the recipient of his care. What Daniel experiences in this moment is the collapse of a self-protective cognitive bias known as positive illusion, the tendency we have to perceive our relationships as more mutual, more reciprocal, and more genuinely seen than they may actually be. He had believed, at some functional level, that his care was received as care. The email proves it was received as content, material for a different intimacy, with a different person. His response, stillness, coffee, a lawyer's name by 9, is the behavior of someone who has shifted from the emotional to the operational register. He does not collapse because he has understood that collapse would be wasted on a situation that requires clarity. Simon was a compact, unhurried man who listened more than he spoke, which I respected immediately. I told him everything in approximately 40 minutes. He took notes with a fountain pen, which seemed deliberately old-fashioned and somehow reassuring. At the end, he asked 3 clarifying questions, then sat back and said, "You want this clean." "I want it accurate," I said, "and I want it finished." "Those are compatible," he said. "Give me 10 days. I gave him 10 days. In those 10 days, I continued living in the apartment, sleeping in the bed, making coffee in the mornings and dinner in the evenings, loading the dishwasher and taking the dry cleaning, and doing all the invisible things that kept the household operational. Vivienne watched me with the careful attention of someone waiting for an explosion that wasn't coming. She had apologized for the dinner, briefly, and with the efficiency of someone meeting a minimum requirement. I had accepted it with a nod. She had seemed simultaneously relieved and unsettled, which was accurate. I did not tell her I had opened the laptop. On the 4th day, her parents called to confirm the date of our annual winter gathering, a dinner at our apartment that we hosted every December, a tradition of 6 years. I confirmed the date with her mother, Elise, who was warm and fond and who had always treated me with more genuine interest than her daughter managed. I extended the invitation to include my own parents, my brother, 2 of our mutual friends, and, with particular deliberateness, our neighbors Carla and Fitz, who were old friends of Philippe's and who had introduced him to the social circle where Vivienne eventually met him professionally. I mentioned to Vivienne that I had expanded the guest list. She frowned briefly and said it was getting large. I said it felt like a good year to do it properly. She accepted this. She thought I was mounting a reconciliation. I could see it in the way she began, over those 10 days, to be slightly warmer, not genuinely warmer, but performing warmth as a preemptive strategy. Small touches on the arm. A question about my work that was the first in several months. She was reading the situation as one she could still manage, and she was beginning to manage it. This was, I had come to understand, her primary relationship with the world. Everything was a situation that could be managed if you identified the correct approach early enough. She was not fundamentally unkind. She was fundamentally managerial. The distinction mattered to me as I planned, because I did not want to be cruel. I wanted to be accurate. On the 9th day, Simon called. The documents were ready. He recommended I wait until after the gathering to serve them, not for dramatic reasons, but for practical ones related to asset assessment. I told him I agreed. On the evening before the dinner, I cooked. I made a lamb dish, the same one from her birthday, the one that had apparently taken too long and pleased me too much. I made it because I wanted to, and because the kitchen was mine as much as hers, and because the version of me that would stop cooking things he was proud of had not yet arrived and was not coming. At this stage, the psychological dynamic between Daniel and Vivienne undergoes its most significant quiet reversal, and this is where Vivienne's primary defense mechanism is most clearly exposed. Vivienne's brief apology after the dinner is a textbook example of pro forma repair, an acknowledgement calibrated not to genuine remorse, but to the minimum required to restabilize the relational environment. She does not apologize for what she said. She apologizes for the disruption his exit caused. The distinction is important. True apology requires taking full ownership of harm. Vivienne's version manages the aftermath without engaging with the cause. Her subsequent behavioral shift, the warmer tone, the questions about his work, is equally revealing. She is not responding to guilt. She is responding to unpredictability. Daniel, for the first time in their marriage, has behaved in a way she did not script, and her system has activated its default response: engage, manage, restore equilibrium. This is the defense mechanism of control deployed as intimacy. She performs connection as a means of regaining the predictable environment she requires. Daniel's decision to continue the domestic routines, coffee, dinner, dry cleaning, while planning his exit is psychologically complex and worth examining carefully. On one level, it is strategic. Maintaining normalcy prevents Vivienne from adjusting her own position before he is ready. On another level, it is authentic. He is genuinely the person who does these things. Stopping them would not feel like power. It would feel like self-punishment. The lamb dish cooked the night before the dinner is the story's most quietly defiant act, not because it is directed at Vivienne, but because it is entirely indifferent to her. He cooks it because he wants to, full stop. This is the first clear sign of recovered autonomy. He is no longer doing things in order to produce a particular response in her. He is doing things because they are his to do. The dinner was on a Saturday. By 7:30, the apartment was warm with voices and the particular social energy of a gathering where people are genuinely pleased to see each other. My mother talking with Elise, my brother in the kitchen doorway, Carla and Fitz already into their second glass of wine, the mutual friends arranging themselves on the long sofa. Vivienne was magnificent, as she always was in managed social environments. She moved through the room with practiced ease, attentive and warm, every inch the gracious host. I watched her and thought, she is good at this. I had always thought she was good at this. The thinking did not hurt the way it might have a month ago. I had placed one item on the dining table before guests arrived, a sealed envelope beside Vivienne's place setting, her name written on the front in my handwriting. She noticed it when people were finding their seats. She looked at it, then at me. I looked back pleasantly and began to pour wine. During the first course, I stood up. The table quieted with the expectancy of someone about to make a toast. "Thank you all for being here," I said. 6 years of this gathering, and I've never actually said what it means to have the people who matter in one room. So thank you. Genuinely. I paused. I also want to be honest with you tonight, because you are all people who deserve honesty, and I have been in possession of certain information for 10 days that changes the shape of what this room means going forward. The room had gone very still. My mother's glass was halfway to her lips. Vivienne and I are separating. The papers are prepared. I have not yet told her the timing, which is why there is an envelope beside her plate. I turned to Vivienne. Her face was a controlled mask with something running fast behind it. "There's nothing in the envelope that will surprise you. It is simply the documentation of what you already know," she said, very quietly. "Daniel, you are excellent at many things, Vivienne," I said, without unkindness. I have always genuinely admired that. But one of the things you are not excellent at is valuing what is quiet and steady and true. I don't think you know how to. I don't think that's entirely your fault. But it has been mine to live with, and I'm choosing, now, not to live with it anymore. Carla had gone still in a way that told me she knew, or had guessed, more than she had said. Elise was looking at the tablecloth with the expression of a woman who is not surprised and is very, very sad. Vivienne stood up. "This is not the place," she said. "I know," I said, which is why I kept it brief. She picked up the envelope, walked out of the dining room. A moment later, I heard the bedroom door close. I sat back down. I looked around the table, at the stillness, the held breath, the complicated love of people who were trying to know how to be in this moment. And I said, "I made lamb. Let's eat." And we did, slowly at first, and then with the particular warmth that honest moments sometimes produce in their aftermath. Quieter than before, more real, stripped of the performance that dinner parties usually require. My mother refilled her own glass, and then mine. My brother told a story about his dog that was genuinely funny. Carla, after a long pause, reached over and put her hand on my arm for a moment without saying anything. The dinner lasted until 11. Nobody left early. The dinner scene is the story's psychological fulcrum, and what makes it work, both narratively and psychologically, is the precise contrast between what every person in the room expected and what actually occurred. Vivienne arrived at the table expecting to host a gathering she had, in her mind, already organized. Her recent performance of warmth toward Daniel had been a successful management strategy, she believed. The situation had been contained, the equilibrium restored. The envelope beside her plate is the first disruption to this model, a variable she did not introduce and cannot immediately assess. Daniel's speech does something unusual and psychologically sophisticated. It refuses to be a confrontation. He does not accuse. He does not enumerate betrayals. He makes two statements. We are separating and I admire you, but you do not know how to value what is quiet. And then he sits down. This confounds Vivienne's entire preparation. She has unconsciously rehearsed for an emotional scene, perhaps accusation, perhaps tears, perhaps demands. None of those come. What comes instead is calm, factual, and public, delivered in the presence of her mother, his parents, and people who know both of them. There is nothing to deflect. There is no emotional register to redirect. Elisa's expression, not surprised, very sad, is a detail of enormous psychological weight. It suggests that the people closest to Vivienne have observed the pattern long enough to recognize this moment as an arrival rather than a shock. This is the testimony of the room without a word being spoken. Daniel's instruction, "I made lamb. Let's eat," is the scene's most revealing moment. It is not bravado. It is a person who has made his honest statement and is now, fully and without drama, returning to the things he does because he loves doing them. The lamb is not a prop. It is evidence of who he is when he is allowed to simply be that. Vivienne did not come out of the bedroom that night. I slept on the sofa without particular discomfort. I had slept on worse in graduate school, and woke to the sound of her on the phone in the kitchen at 7, her voice low and controlled and very fast. She spent the following week managing. That is the only accurate word. She called her lawyer. She called her closest colleague. She called Carla, who told me later, with a kind of exhausted honesty, that she had not been able to offer much comfort, given what she knew. What Carla knew, it turned out, was more than I had realized. She and Fitz had been aware of Philippe for 5 months. They had been waiting, in the uncomfortable position of mutual friends, to see what Vivienne would do. The professional consequence arrived without my involvement. Elise, I later learned, had spoken to Robert, Vivienne's father, the morning after the dinner. Robert had, in the quiet way of men who hold significant positions, mentioned certain concerns to a contact at the regulatory body that oversaw the industry in which Vivienne and Philippe both operated. A conflict of interest review was opened. It did not threaten her career. She was too skilled and too careful for that. But it produced a formal separation of their professional dealings, a reassignment of joint client accounts, and a review panel that appeared on her calendar for 6 weeks. Philippe, for his part, ended the arrangement within 10 days of the dinner. I know this not because Vivienne told me, but because she stopped being careful about what she left visible, and one evening I saw a message preview on her phone. Not snooping, simply proximity. That read, "I can't be part of this anymore. I'm sorry, V." She noticed me noticing. She put the phone face down. Neither of us said anything. In that same week, something else was happening that had nothing to do with any of this. 3 years earlier, before I had fully accepted the version of myself that Vivienne seemed to require, quieter, smaller, less professionally visible, I had submitted a proposal to the City Council for a large public green corridor project in the Eastern District. The project would connect 4 neighborhoods through a design landscape of walking paths, community gardens, and managed woodland. I had put 18 months of thought into it. It had been declined at the first stage of review, and I had, with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to accommodating disappointment, filed it and moved on. On a Wednesday morning, while Vivienne was at the review panel and the apartment was mine alone, I received an email from the city's planning department. The corridor project had been resubmitted by a colleague who had kept faith with it when I hadn't. It had passed the second stage. They wanted the original architect involved. They wanted me. I sat at the kitchen table with that email for a long time. Not because the decision was complicated, because I was trying to remember the version of me that had written that proposal, the one who had spent 18 months on something he believed in, and work out how far away he was. He was closer than I had thought. Here completes the inversion of the power dynamic that the story has been building toward since the restaurant dinner in part 1. But the most psychologically interesting shift is not external. It is in Daniel's internal relationship to his own professional identity. For 6 years, Daniel had operated within a relational structure in which Vivienne's career, status, and social authority constituted the organizing principle of their shared life. His work, landscape architecture, public space design, had been relegated to background noise. This was partly Vivienne's doing, but partly Daniel's own. He had accommodated the hierarchy so thoroughly that he had internalized it. The corridor project, abandoned after a single rejection, is the clearest evidence. He did not fight for it. He filed it, because filing felt like what a person of his relative standing in that household was supposed to do. The email from the planning department is psychologically significant not as a plot device, but as a mirror. It reflects back a version of Daniel that existed before the accommodation began, a version that had produced work good enough to survive 3 years, a second-stage review, and a colleague's sustained faith. The work did not require Vivienne's validation to be real. It was real without her. He had simply forgotten to check. Philippe's withdrawal from the situation, "I can't be part of this anymore," is worth examining briefly as a secondary psychological portrait. His exit is not remorse. It is risk management. He was embedded in a situation that had become professionally and socially costly, and he removed himself with the same calculation that had presumably governed his entry. Vivienne, who had been in a dynamic with 2 men simultaneously, finds herself abruptly in a dynamic with none, her husband exiting on his own terms, her affair partner exiting on his. The experience of simultaneous abandonment by both, after years of managing both, is the particular consequence of treating relationships as systems to be operated rather than people to be genuinely with. Daniel's stillness when he sees the message preview, and Vivienne's silent acknowledgement, is the most honest exchange they have had in years. The divorce took 4 months. Simon was efficient. Vivienne's lawyer was equally efficient, and both parties had agreed on the salient facts quickly enough that the process moved without the particular bitterness of contested separations. We divided things with the accuracy of people who were, at core, both practical. The apartment was sold. I moved into a 2-room place near the Eastern District, close to the corridor project site, where I could walk to the office and see, from the corner window, the edge of the green space beginning to take shape. I will not pretend the 4 months were easy. They were not. There is grief in the end of any marriage, even one that has been, in retrospect, more administrative than intimate for longer than either party admitted. I grieve the version of things I had believed in rather than the version that had actually existed, which is perhaps the most common and most honest form of marital grief. I let myself feel it without shame and without performance, in the evenings in the 2-room apartment, and then I went to sleep and got up and went to work. The corridor project was, and remains, the best work of my professional life. I say that not with false modesty. I say it because it is measurably true. The design won 2 regional awards in its first year. The community gardens were adopted by 4 schools in the adjacent neighborhoods. On a Saturday in June, I walked the full length of the completed first phase and watched people using what I had made. Children on the paths, elderly residents on the benches, a young couple reading in the managed woodland, and felt something that I recognized, after a moment, as pride. Clean, uncomplicated, fully my own. My mother visited the site on the day of the opening ceremony. She walked beside me along the central path and said very little, which is her way when she is most moved. At the end she said, "You built this during your divorce." "I did," I said. "Then the divorce was worth something," she said. She was right, though I would not have been able to say so at the time. The end of the marriage had not been a loss in any simple sense. It had been a retrieval of time, of energy, of creative ambition, of the basic right to be taken seriously in your own domestic life. What had felt like subtraction was, looked at from the other side, multiplication. I ran into Vivienne once, 8 months after the divorce was finalized, at a coffee shop near the financial district. She looked well, composed, as always, but with something different in it, something slightly less orchestrated. She saw me and stopped. And for a moment we were just 2 people who had once been very important to each other, standing in a coffee shop on a Tuesday morning. "The park looks beautiful," she said. "I walked through it last week." "Thank you," I said. A pause. Not uncomfortable, just honest. "I think," she said, carefully, "that I never actually knew how to be in a relationship with someone I respected." It was the truest thing she had ever said to me. I held it carefully. "I think that's probably right," I said. "I hope you figure it out." She nodded. We said goodbye without drama, without residue. She turned left outside. I turned right. The street absorbed us both, which is what streets do. I did not feel triumph. I did not feel sadness. I felt something quieter and more durable than either, the particular ease of a person who has made his way back to a life that is, in all its ordinary specificity, entirely and unmistakably his. The project is in its second phase now. The morning walk to the site takes 12 minutes. I make coffee before I go, in the small kitchen of the two-room apartment, and I drink it by the window watching the light come up, and I think, this is enough. More than enough. It is, quietly, everything. The story arrives at its psychological destination, and it is worth being precise about what that destination actually is, because it is not happiness in the uncomplicated sense, and it is not triumph. It is something more sustainable and more honest, the restoration of a coherent self. Daniel's grief during the 4 months of divorce proceedings is portrayed with notable authenticity. He grieves not what the marriage was, but what he had believed it to be, the positive illusion he had maintained as a coping mechanism. This distinction is psychologically significant because it means the grief is real without being a reason to doubt the decision. He is not mourning Vivienne. He is mourning the story about Vivienne that he had needed to sustain in order to stay. Allowing that grief without shame, feeling it, sleeping, waking, working, is the behavior of someone whose coping mechanisms have shifted from avoidance to genuine processing. The Corridor Project functions as more than a professional success. It is a psychometric instrument, a measure of how much of himself he had suppressed. The fact that the work was good enough to survive 3 years of his own withdrawal from it, to pass a second-stage review, to win regional recognition, is evidence that the self he had made smaller in Vivienne's house was not a diminished self. It was the same self, simply not given room. The coffee shop encounter with Vivienne is the scene that resolves the story's central psychological question. Has Daniel processed the experience, or merely survived it? His response to her comment, "I think that's probably right. I hope you figure it out," is the answer. He receives her honesty without needing to add to it. He wishes her well without needing her to suffer. This is the psychological marker of genuine closure, not the absence of feeling, but the absence of need. He no longer needs her to understand, to apologize, to be different. He needed those things at various points during those 6 years. He does not need them now. The final image, morning coffee, window light, 12-minute walk to a landscape he designed, is the story's quietest and most complete statement. He has not rebuilt his life around a new relationship or a dramatic reinvention. He has simply cleared the space and returned to what was always his. That is not a small thing. For many people who have lived through years of self-erasure in a relationship, it is the hardest thing there is. To understand this story fully, not just its events, but the internal logic that made those events inevitable, you have to begin with a question that neither Daniel nor Vivienne ever directly asked during 6 years of marriage. What does this person actually need, and am I capable of providing it? Daniel's fundamental emotional need was simple, though not trivial, to be seen. Not celebrated, not praised in public, not elevated above his station. Seen. To have his care received as care, his work acknowledged as real, his presence in the room registered as something more than logistical utility. This is among the most basic human relational requirements, and it is, for people in chronically accommodating roles, the one most consistently unmet. Daniel had developed elaborate internal compensations for its absence, pride in his work, satisfaction in his domestic competence, the quiet pleasure of a life, well maintained. But these compensations, however real, were always downstream of the primary need. He was managing without, not thriving in the absence of. Vivienne's emotional needs were different in kind and, critically, in her own awareness of them. She needed to feel superior, not in a cruel or conscious way, but functionally. She required a relational environment in which she was undisputably the highest status person, the most admired, the most capable. This need, in a relationship with an equally capable and genuinely talented partner, should have been impossible to sustain. It was sustained because Daniel, through years of accommodation, had made it easy. He had stepped back, made himself smaller, stopped advocating for his own work, until the hierarchy she required was simply a description of their daily life. She did not have to construct her superiority. He had constructed it for her, one small concession at a time. This is the story's central tragedy and its central lesson. The unmet needs of both people were, paradoxically, served by the same dynamic. Daniel's need to be useful, to maintain relational harmony, to avoid the discomfort of conflict. These kept him in a position where Vivienne's need for superiority could remain unchallenged. They were, in this way, a perfectly dysfunctional fit. Each person's coping strategy perfectly enabled the other's wound. The breaking point at the restaurant was not, ultimately, about the comment Vivienne made. It was about the moment Daniel's internal accounting shifted. The cost of maintaining this dynamic finally exceeded the comfort of its familiarity. Once that shift occurs, it cannot be reversed because it is not an emotional decision. It is a cognitive one. He had simply, finally, done the math. What follows, the documentation, the dinner, the speech, the corridor project, the 12-minute morning walk, is not a revenge arc. It is a reclamation arc. Each step returns to Daniel something that was always his professional voice, his dignity in front of the people he loves, his right to be taken seriously, his capacity to build things that matter. He does not find these things in a new relationship or a dramatic gesture. He finds them in the ordinary, daily, unperformed act of living as himself. The deepest lesson this story offers is not about betrayal. Betrayal is the occasion, not the subject. The subject is the cost of making yourself acceptable to someone who has not earned that accommodation, and the extraordinary, quiet relief of stopping.